There was a kitchen in 1943. No freezer, maybe an icebox. Ration books sitting on the counter next to a coffee tin of bacon grease. A mother feeding 5 children on $11 a week. And every single meal came from scratch, from almost nothing. And it was good. Not sad. Not desperate. Good in the way that made grown men tear up describing it 70 years later. Here are 60 of those meals. The ones no cookbook remembers. The ones that fed this country when this country had nothing left to give. Number 60 cornmeal mush. 3 cents a pound in 1943. You cooked it slow in a cast iron pot, stirring until it thickened into something warm and dense and faintly sweet on its own, poured into a bowl with a spoon of bacon grease melted on top. In the morning it was breakfast, sliced cold and fried. In the afternoon it was something else entirely, a different texture, a different meal, the same 3 cents. Today we call it polenta and charge $14 a plate in restaurants that have never heard of a ration book. Number 59 milk toast. New England and the Midwest every winter morning of the 1940s. Stale bread toasted hard, laid in a bowl, hot milk poured over until it softened. Salt. Sometimes butter if there was butter. This was the sick day meal. The cold morning meal. The meal a mother made when the pantry had almost nothing left and she still needed to put something warm in front of her children. Nobody makes it anymore. Nobody even remembers it existed. Number 58. Fried salt pork with gravy over biscuits. Appalachia and the Deep South, 1940 through 1945. Salt pork ran 8 cents a pound. You sliced it thin, fried it until the fat rendered and the edges curled, then made a gravy in the same pan from the drippings and a handful of flour and whatever milk was in the house. Poured over biscuits that had been baked before the sun came up. This was not a humble breakfast. This was architecture, built to hold a man through 10 hours of physical labor without complaint. Number 57. Oatmeal with bacon drippings. Rural Midwest every cold morning of the decade. Oats cost 5 cents a pound. The drippings were free, saved in a tin on the back of the stove, never thrown away, never wasted. A spoon of drippings stirred into the oatmeal added fat and salt, and a smokiness that no amount of brown sugar and cream can replicate. The fat slowed the digestion of the oats. Steady energy. No crash, no hunger by 9 o'clock. They knew things about fuel that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 56, egg in a hole. Nationwide 1940s. A piece of bread, a circle torn from its center, laid flat in a greased skillet. An egg cracked directly into the hole and cooked until the white set and the yolk stayed soft. Eggs ran 18 cents a dozen. 1 egg, 1 slice of bread, 1 pan. Fed a child completely. Took 4 minutes. Left 1 dish to wash. Grandma just called it breakfast. The food blogs of 2024 call it a one-pan shakshuka-adjacent egg toast and explain it like it was just invented. Number 55, hoe cakes. The Deep South and Appalachia every morning of the 1940s. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, a spoon of lard, mixed into a batter and dropped onto a hot skillet. Crisp on the outside, tender in the center. Eaten with sorghum syrup or just with the grease they cooked in. Today we call them Johnny cakes and charge $11 for 3 at brunch spots in Brooklyn that use heritage cornmeal and describe the dish like they discovered it. The women of eastern Kentucky made them for 40 years without a single Instagram post. Number 54, crackers and milk. Rural America, coast to coast, throughout the entire decade. Saltines broken into a glass of cold milk, eaten with a spoon. 10 cents for a box of crackers that lasted a week. This was not the meal you made when nothing else was available. It was the meal certain families ate on certain nights because it was theirs. A ritual, a thing the children looked forward to. The food industry wants you to see it as deprivation. It was not deprivation. It was supper, and it was enough, and everyone went to bed full. Number 53. Potato and onion hash. Working class Northeast and Midwest, 1940s. Last night's boiled potatoes diced, an onion sliced thin. Bacon grease in the pan, heat high, left alone long enough to develop a crust on the bottom that you scraped up and flipped and let crust again. Potatoes cost 2 cents a pound. The onion cost almost nothing. The grease cost nothing at all. Nothing was invented for this dish. Nothing was bought that wasn't already in the house. That was the rule of the 1940s kitchen. The leftover was not the lesser meal. It was just the next meal. Number 52, sweet potato biscuits. The Deep South, 1940 through 1948. Mashed sweet potato folded into the biscuit dough. Not for sweetness, though they were sweet, but because sweet potatoes cost 3 cents a pound and stretched the flour further and made the biscuits softer and kept them from going stale as fast. They were also delivering vitamin A and iron and fiber with every bite, which no white flour biscuit has ever done. She was right. Everything she knew was right. She just didn't have a nutrition label to prove it. Number 51, buckwheat pancakes with sorghum. Appalachia and the upper Midwest throughout the 1940s. Buckwheat flour cost 4 cents a pound and had a flavor. Dark, slightly bitter, deeply earthy, that white flour pancakes have never approached, poured thin and cooked fast and stacked high, and drizzled with sorghum syrup instead of maple, which was expensive and scarce. By 1960, buckwheat had nearly vanished from American grocery shelves. The industry had decided white flour was progress. Buckwheat was old. Buckwheat was poor. Buckwheat, it turns out, has twice the protein of wheat flour and more iron than spinach. In 1941, the United States government mandated that commercial white flour be enriched with B vitamins and iron. They called it a public health breakthrough. Here is what they did not say. The reason enrichment was necessary was that the milling industry had spent 30 years stripping those exact nutrients out of the grain in order to produce a whiter, finer, longer-lasting product. They created the deficiency. Then they sold the solution. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The grandmothers using buckwheat and whole cornmeal and sweet potato were never nutrient deficient. They were never the problem. The problem was the thing that replaced them. Number 50, vegetable soup from ham hocks. South and Midwest, 1940s. Ham hocks cost 5 cents each. You put them in the pot with water and whatever vegetables the garden or the root cellar had. Turnips, carrots, cabbage, dried field peas, and you let it go for 3 hours. The hock gave the broth a richness that no bouillon cube has ever replicated. The collagen released from the bone made the liquid thick and silky by the time it was done. That pot sat on the back of the stove for days. Every meal came from it. Nothing was added back that wasn't already earned. Number 49 bean and fatback soup. Appalachia and the Deep South, 1940 through 1946. Dried navy beans cost 5 cents a pound. A piece of fatback cost 6. Together, in a pot of water with an onion and some black pepper, they made a soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, a soup that fed a family of 6 for 2 full days. The beans swelled and softened and absorbed the fat and turned the broth into something that smelled like the inside of a warm house in January. This was not poor man's food. This was engineering, protein, fat, calories, delivered for 11 cents total. Number 48, tomato soup. Nationwide 1940s. Not Campbell's. Real tomatoes. Home canned in August when they cost almost nothing. Opened in February when they cost something. Cooked down in a pot with butter and onion and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. Thickened with a spoon of flour or thinned with a cup of milk. Poured over crackers. This was the soup that tasted like summer preserved. Like someone had captured August in a jar and opened it in the middle of winter and let it fill the whole kitchen with something warm and red and true. Number 47. Oxtail stew, Black American South and the urban North throughout the 1940s. Oxtail ran 3 cents a pound because nobody wanted it except the people who knew what it could do. Browned in a heavy pot, covered with water, cooked for 4 hours until the meat fell from the bone, and the collagen turned the liquid into a gravy that coated the back of a spoon. Served over white rice or with cornbread on the side. Today, oxtail is a $34 entree in New York City restaurants. The people who invented this preparation never saw a dime of that. Number 46. Potato and leek soup, Irish American communities in the Northeast, 1940s. Potatoes at 2 cents a pound, leeks pulled from the kitchen garden, butter, salt, water, cooked until the potatoes fell apart and the leeks melted into the broth. Eaten hot in winter, sometimes cold in summer. The Plaza Hotel in Manhattan was serving a version of this, chilled, with cream, renamed Vichyssoise, for $1.25 a bowl in 1941. The same soup, a different dining room, a different price tag. That is not progress. That is a ZEEP code deciding what something is worth. Number 45. Chicken foot soup. Southern black families and immigrant communities throughout the 1940s. Chicken feet cost 1 cent a pound, sometimes nothing at all. The butcher gave them away. Singed, cleaned, simmered for hours with onion and garlic, and whatever herbs grew outside the back door. The feet gave up every gram of gelatin and collagen they contained, and the result was a broth so rich it set solid in the icebox overnight. Today we call it bone broth and charge $9 a cup at wellness cafes. Grandma just called it not wasting the chicken. She was right. Number 44, cornmeal dumpling soup. Rural South, 1940s. A pot of pork broth, made from whatever bones remained after a hog was broken down, brought to a simmer, and cornmeal dumplings dropped in by the spoonful. They swelled and cooked through and took on the flavor of the broth and developed a texture on the outside that was soft and faintly resistant, like nothing that comes out of a can or a box. This was not a recipe, it was a technique. Passed mouth to hand across 4 generations of Southern kitchens, and then, somewhere in the 1960s, quietly lost. Number 43. Cabbage and potato soup, Eastern European immigrant families in the Midwest throughout the 1940s. A Polish grandmother's Monday meal, every Monday, without negotiation. Cabbage at 2 cents a pound, potatoes at 2 cents, a marrow bone from the butcher for a nickel, caraway seeds from a tin that had been refilled for 20 years. The soup was sour and rich and warming in the specific way that only fermented or long-cooked cabbage can produce. Her daughters made it. Her granddaughters stopped. By 1975 it had left the family entirely. Nobody thought to write it down. Number 42, navy bean soup with cornbread. Nationwide, especially rural South and Midwest, 1940s. Beans and cornmeal together form a complete protein. Every essential amino acid delivered in a bowl and a piece of bread for a total cost of 8 cents. The women who cooked this did not know the term complete protein. They did not need to. They knew that a family fed on beans and cornbread was a family that stayed well. They knew it in their hands and their timing and their pantry. The science caught up to them eventually. They had a 60-year head start. 41 peanut soup. Virginia and the Carolinas throughout the 1940s. Peanuts at 6 cents a pound, ground or crushed, cooked into a broth with onion and celery and a piece of salt pork, thinned with water or milk. A tradition that runs straight through Virginia's black culinary history, influenced and documented by George Washington Carver, who spent his life demonstrating what peanuts could do and was largely ignored by the people who could have profited from listening. The soup is almost gone now. A handful of restaurants in Williamsburg, Virginia still make it. Most of them charge $12 a bowl, 40 skillet cornbread. South in Appalachia, every single day of the 1940s, a cast iron skillet greased with bacon fat slid into a hot oven, and the batter poured in so it hit the hot grease and immediately began to form a crust. That crust, dark, crackling, almost brittle on the bottom, is the thing. It is the reason cast iron exists. You cannot make it in a glass dish. You cannot fake it with a non-stick pan. The skillet remembered every meal it had ever cooked, and it gave something back to every meal after. 39 salt-rising bread. Appalachian communities, 1940s. No commercial yeast. The starter was made from cornmeal and warm water and salt, left overnight in a warm place until it fermented and began to smell sharp and strange, like aged cheese, like something alive and working. The bread it produced had a dense, fine crumb and a flavor that no yeast bread has ever replicated. It took 3 days from start to finish. It required attention and patience and a specific understanding of temperature that no recipe could fully explain. It lived in the hands. When the hands stopped making it, it was gone. 38 lard biscuits. Nationwide, 1940s. Lard at 8 cents a pound, cut cold into flour with a knife or the fingertips. Just enough buttermilk to bring the dough together, rolled thick, baked fast in a hot oven. The result was a biscuit that shattered when you pulled it apart and steamed from the inside and had a flavor that vegetable shortening has never once approached. Today, Southern Revival restaurants sell laminated biscuits for $7 each and act like they've discovered something. The women of the 1940s made better ones every morning before anyone else in the house was awake. 37 cracklin' bread. Deep South, 1940s. Pork cracklings, the crisp rendered skin and fat left after lard was rendered, folded directly into cornbread batter before baking. They melted partially in the oven and left behind pockets of rich, porky flavor and a texture in every bite that plain cornbread cannot achieve. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Rendered lard has a fat profile closer to olive oil than to the hydrogenated shortening that replaced it. The crackling was not the unhealthy part of the 1940s diet. The thing that replaced it was 36 fry bread. Native American communities in Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, 1940s. Flour, lard, salt, water worked into a dough and stretched thin and dropped into hot fat until it puffed and blistered and turned gold. Eaten plain. Eaten with beans. Eaten because it was what was available when everything else had been taken. This bread carries a history that sits heavier than any other item on this list. It is the bread of displacement and dispossession, made from commodity rations issued by a government that had already taken everything else. It is also, somehow, one of the most beautiful things that came out of that decade. 35 potato rolls. Midwest and Northeast, 1940s. Mashed potato worked directly into the bread dough. Not for flavor, though it added flavor, But because potato starch absorbs water differently than flour and produces a roll that stays soft for days instead of going stale overnight. A trick every grandmother knew and no bread manufacturer bothered to explain until the 1990s, when potato bread became a marketing category. The grandmothers were not doing this for the market. They were doing it because stale bread was wasted bread, and wasted bread was money they did not have. 34. Persimmon bread. Rural South and the Ozarks, 1940s. Wild persimmons, small, astringent, until the first frost turned them sweet, gathered from trees that still grow along fence lines and creek banks across the Mid-South, mashed into a batter with flour, eggs, molasses, and spices, baked in a loaf until it came out dense and dark and spiced like nothing that grows in a grocery store. The flavor is impossible to describe to someone who has never tasted a wild persimmon. It is something between a date and a plum, and something that has no name in any store. 33. Yeast rolls from potato water. Nationwide, 1940s. The water drained from a pot of boiled potatoes was never poured down the drain. It was saved, cooled, and used to activate the yeast for the next batch of rolls. The starch in the potato water fed the yeast and produced a faster, more vigorous rise and a roll with a softer crumb and a richer flavor than water alone could give. This was not a recipe from a cookbook. This was knowledge, accumulated, tested, passed down, practiced. The kind of knowledge that lives in kitchens and dies when kitchens stop being used. In 1911, Procter & Gamble introduced Crisco. For the next 4 decades, they distributed free cookbooks, tens of millions of copies, that called for Crisco specifically and described lard as old-fashioned and unsanitary. They placed advertisements in women's magazines. They funded home economics programs in public schools. By 1950, the campaign was working. By 1960, lard had nearly vanished from the middle-class American kitchen. The science eventually confirmed what the grandmothers already knew. Lard is approximately 45% monounsaturated fat, the same fat profile as olive oil. The trans fats in hydrogenated Crisco were linked to cardiovascular disease. The FDA banned partially hydrogenated oils in 2018. Procter & Gamble's campaign took 40 years to execute. The correction took 80 years to arrive. That is not progress. That is a corporation deciding what your grandmother cooked was wrong, and then spending 40 years proving it. 32. Pinto beans and cornbread Appalachia and the Deep South every week of the 1940s. The beans soaked overnight, cooked all day with an onion and a piece of salt pork until they were soft, and the broth had thickened and gone slightly creamy from the starch. The cornbread baked while the beans finished. You crumbled the cornbread into the bowl and poured the beans over it. That was it. That was the meal. No apology, no side dish needed, no explanation required. It fed families for a generation, and the families were not diminished by it. They were held together by it. 31. Fried fatback with greens Rural South, 1940s. Fatback at 6 cents a pound, sliced and fried until the fat had rendered and the edges were crisp and the kitchen smelled like something primal and right. The greens, whatever the garden gave, turnip or mustard or collard, cooked in the drippings left behind. This was not a side dish with a protein. This was the meal. The fatback was the flavor, the fat, and the protein. The greens were the vehicle. Together they were a complete nutritional system that rural Southern families had been running on for over a century. 30. Chicken and dumplings. Nationwide, 1940s. One old hen, past laying age, worth almost nothing at market, boiled for 2 hours until the meat fell from the bones. The broth skimmed and seasoned. Dumplings made from flour and lard and buttermilk, dropped in by the spoonful, cooked covered, until they puffed and went dense, and absorbed the flavor of the broth. 1 bird, 7 people, 2 meals, nothing left in the pot at the end of the second day but a clean bone and a story. The bird cost 15 cents. The story was free, 29 stuffed cabbage rolls. Eastern European immigrant communities, Midwest, 1940s. Cabbage leaves blanched soft, filled with ground pork and rice mixed with onion and black pepper, rolled tight, packed into a Dutch oven, covered with canned tomatoes, and baked until the house smelled like Sunday, even on a Wednesday. Cabbage at 2 cents a pound. Pork scraps ground at home. A meal that carried an entire cultural identity inside a leaf. The children of those immigrants grew up and moved to the suburbs and stopped making it. Their children never learned. By 1970, the recipe was living in nursing homes. 28 salt cod and potatoes. Portuguese and Italian immigrant communities in the Northeast, 1940s. The cod had been salted and dried and needed 2 days of soaking to return to something edible, changing the water 3 times, rinsing again. Then fried in olive oil with garlic and laid over boiled potatoes and dressed with a little vinegar. Salt cod ran 12 cents a pound and lasted indefinitely without refrigeration. It was the protein that crossed the ocean with the immigrants and stayed on the table for 30 years. It tasted like the old country. That was not an accident. 27. Hog jowl and black-eyed peas. Deep South throughout the 1940s. The jowl, the cheek of the hog, fatty and rich and deeply flavored, cooked low and slow with dried black-eyed peas, until the fat had rendered into the beans, and the beans had absorbed everything the jowl had to give. This was the New Year's Day meal. It was also Tuesday's dinner. It was also whatever day the pantry needed stretching. The ritual and the practicality lived in the same pot without contradiction. That was the genius of the 1940s kitchen. Nothing was only ceremonial. Everything fed someone. 26. Squirrel mulligan stew. Rural Appalachia and the Ozarks, 1940s. A mulligan was a community stew. Everything thrown in, whatever anyone had. Squirrel was free protein from the woods, plentiful and lean, stewed with potatoes and onions and dried beans and whatever vegetables remained in the root cellar. 8 people fed from what the woods gave up on a Saturday morning. This was not desperation cooking. This was coordinated cooking. Men who knew the woods and women who knew the pot, working in a system so efficient it required no explanation and left nothing to waste. 25. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust, Mississippi Delta and Southern River communities, 1940s. The catfish came from the river that morning, cleaned on the bank, carried home, dragged through seasoned cornmeal, and laid into a skillet of hot lard. The crust formed immediately, sealed, crackling, golden by the time the fish had cooked through. Free protein, 15 minutes, a skillet of hot fat, and a handful of cornmeal. The Delta communities built an entire food culture on this dish, a culture that is now sold back to them in restaurants at $22 a plate, with hand-ground artisan cornmeal, 24, liver and onions. Nationwide, 1940s. Beef liver ran 10 cents a pound because nobody wanted it except the people who understood what it was. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, cooked fast in a hot pan with sliced onions until the exterior crusted and the inside stayed just barely pink. Rich and iron-forward and deeply savory in a way that no other cut of beef approaches. It is the most nutrient-dense food available. the highest natural concentration of vitamin A, B12, and iron of any common food. Today it costs $2 a pound and sits in the case because nobody buys it anymore. They told you to want the ribeye instead. 23. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Nationwide military influence throughout the 1940s. Thin-sliced dried beef in a cream gravy poured over white toast. The soldiers had a name for it that this channel will not repeat. At home it was Sunday supper. Economical, filling, made in 20 minutes from ingredients that kept on a shelf. The dried beef cost almost nothing. The gravy used a spoon of flour and a cup of milk. The whole dish fed 4 for 30 cents. It was not glamorous. It was not meant to be. It was Tuesday's answer to Friday's pay running short. 22. Fried rabbit with gravy. Rural America, nationwide, 1940s. Rabbit was free if you raised it, 15 cents if you bought it, and contained more protein per pound than beef with less fat than chicken. Cut into pieces, floured, fried in lard until golden, then braised in the drippings with water and onion until tender. The gravy made in the same pan, flour, drippings, water, poured thick over the pieces and eaten with biscuits or cornbread. Rabbit disappeared from the American table in the 1950s when the suburbs arrived, and no one had a hutch in the backyard anymore. The industry called it progress. The protein content did not change. 21. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and fatback. Italian, American, and Southern communities, 1940s. Peppers from the garden, rice cooked with bits of fatback and onion and canned tomato, packed into the hollowed peppers and baked until the peppers softened. And the filling had formed a crust on top, and the whole thing smelled like something someone's grandmother made specifically for you. Nothing bought that wasn't needed. Nothing left over that couldn't be used again. The peppers that were slightly too soft for the table got chopped and added to tomorrow's sauce. This was the operating principle of the 1940s kitchen. The meal never ended. It only transformed. Before 1950, the American family consumed the whole animal: liver, jowl, feet, oxtail, tongue, fatback, heart, kidney. Every cut had a use, and every use had a cook who understood it. After World War II, the industrial meat complex began pushing middle cuts, steaks, chops, boneless breasts as aspirational. The undesirable cuts were quietly exported to overseas markets, rendered into pet food, or discarded entirely. This was not evolution. This was a marketing decision. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A beef liver in 1946 delivered more nutrition per ounce than a ribeye at any price. The grandmothers who cooked every part of the animal were not making do with less. They were eating better than anyone who replaced them. 20. Fried green tomatoes. South in Appalachia, end of every growing season in the 1940s. The tomatoes that didn't ripen before the first frost. Green, firm, slightly acidic, sliced thick, dragged through cornmeal, fried in bacon grease until the crust was crisp and the interior had just softened. Nothing left behind. Nothing surrendered to the cold. This was the meal at the end of the garden season, a way of getting one more use out of something the calendar was about to take. The 1991 film made it famous. The women of 1943 Appalachia made it first. 19. Collard greens with pot liquor. Rural South throughout the 1940s. 2 hours on the stove with a piece of fatback and a handful of black pepper until the greens had given up everything they contained. The liquid left in the pot, dark, silky, the color of strong tea, was not a byproduct. It was the point, poured into a bowl. Cornbread crumbled on top. Every mineral the greens released during cooking was in that liquid. Iron, calcium, folate. A bowl of pot liquor delivered more nutrition per penny than almost anything else available. Grandma just called it not wasting the pot. She was right. 18. Wilted lettuce salad with bacon drippings. Appalachia and the rural Midwest, 1940s. Garden lettuce, loose leaf, pulled fresh, laid in a bowl. Hot bacon drippings poured directly over it with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of sugar, wilting the leaves instantly and coating them in something warm and smoky and bright. This dish sounds wrong. It sounds like a mistake. It is one of the most perfect things that ever came out of a Depression-era garden, and it has almost completely disappeared from American tables since the invention of bottled ranch dressing in 1954, Saventine fried okra. Deep South, throughout the 1940s. Okra at 4 cents a pound in the summer, sliced into rounds, dragged through seasoned cornmeal, fried in lard until crisp on the outside and just tender inside. The mucilage that makes raw okra slippery, the thing everyone complains about, disappears in the heat and transforms into a thickening agent. Science has since confirmed that the mucilaginous fiber in okra lowers LDL cholesterol. The grandmothers serving it every summer Thursday did not know the mechanism. They knew it worked. Their families did not have the same cholesterol problems that arrived with the TV dinner. 16. Creamed corn from the cob. Midwest and South, 1940s. Not canned. A sharp knife drawn down each ear to cut the kernels, then the back of the knife scraped across the cob to release the milk, the starchy liquid inside each kernel that no canning process has ever preserved. Into a pan with butter and salt, cooked until thick and sweet and textured in a way that comes only from that fresh starch releasing in real time. Canned creamed corn is a different food. It shares a name and nothing else. The texture alone is an argument for growing your own. 15. Pickled watermelon rind. South and Black American communities, 1940s. The part of the watermelon everyone throws away, cut from the green skin, cooked with vinegar and sugar and spices, cloves, cinnamon, sometimes ginger, and put up in jars in August to last through winter. Sweet and sour and faintly spiced, a condiment, a side dish, a snack. The rind contains citrulline, which the body converts to arginine, an amino acid that supports cardiovascular function. They threw away nothing. They pickled the waste and made it last 6 months, and ate something that happened to be good for the heart. She was right. Everything she knew was right. 14. Succotash. Native American origin, adopted nationwide by the 1940s. Lima beans and corn, cooked together with bacon fat and onion until the beans were tender and the corn had released its sweetness into the fat. Together, beans and corn, they form a complete protein, every essential amino acid present. The Native American agricultural system that produced this combination, the three sisters, corn and beans and squash planted together, had understood this nutritional complementarity for centuries before any university confirmed it. Grandma just called it succotash. The science caught up eventually. It always does. 13. Stewed tomatoes with bread. Nationwide throughout the 1940s. Overripe tomatoes, the ones too soft for slicing, the ones that would go to waste by morning, cooked down with butter and onion and a pinch of sugar until they collapsed into a thick, sweet, acidic stew. Stale bread torn into pieces and stirred in until it had absorbed the liquid and swelled and become something between a pudding and a soup. Poured warm into a bowl. Eaten with a spoon. This dish existed because nothing was wasted. It tasted like summer and thrift and the specific intelligence of a woman who saw a soft tomato and did not see waste. She saw tomorrow's supper. 12 stacker cake. Appalachian communities throughout the 1940s. Thin gingerbread layers, 6, 7, 8 of them, with dried apple filling spread between each one, and the whole thing left to sit overnight so the layers softened and merged and became something that was no longer a cake in the conventional sense. This was a wedding cake. Each neighbor brought a layer. The more layers, the more popular the family. It required no frosting, no decoration, no bakery. It required a community showing up with something they had made with their own hands. By 1965, the wedding cake was white and tiered and ordered from a shop. The stack cake was gone. 11. Molasses cookies. Nationwide throughout the 1940s. Molasses at 8 cents a quart, the dark, thick, slightly bitter byproduct of sugar refining that the industry eventually replaced with light corn syrup because corn syrup was cheaper and milder and easier to market. A spoon of blackstrap molasses contains iron, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. A spoon of high fructose corn syrup contains none of these things. The cookies made with molasses were chewy and spiced and slightly bitter at the edges, and they delivered actual nutrition with every bite. The industry called the replacement progress. That is not progress. That is removing the nutrition and calling the result an improvement. 10 vinegar pie. Rural South and Midwest 1940s. No lemons in the house. No lemons in the county some weeks. But there was vinegar, apple cider vinegar, a pantry staple, cost almost nothing, kept forever. Combined with eggs and sugar and butter and a touch of vanilla and baked in a pastry shell, it produced something that tastes startlingly like lemon custard pie, bright and sweet and acidic and smooth. A pie that demonstrates without apology that necessity is not the mother of deprivation. It is the mother of invention. The women who made this were not settling, they were solving. There is a difference. 9 bread pudding with whiskey sauce. New Orleans and the Deep South throughout the 1940s. Stale bread, the end of the loaf, the slices that had gone hard, soaked in a custard of eggs and milk and vanilla and sugar, baked until puffed and golden and set, and served with a sauce of butter and sugar and a splash of whatever whiskey was in the house. Today it is a $14 dessert on every Southern Revival menu in America. In 1943 New Orleans, it was Tuesday's answer to Monday's leftover bread. The recipe has not changed. Only the price has 8. Chess pie. South and Appalachia, 1940s. Eggs, sugar, butter, a tablespoon of cornmeal, a splash of vinegar, poured into a pastry shell and baked until the top formed a crackled crust, and the inside was dense and custardy and almost impossibly rich. The origin of the name has been debated for 100 years. Some say it was just pie, chest pie, said fast in a Southern accent. Some say it lived in a pie chest. Nobody knows. Nobody needs to. The taste is not a debate. It is a fact that exists outside of argument and above it. 7. Huckleberry Cobbler, Rural Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Pacific Northwest, 1940s. Huckleberries are not blueberries. They are smaller, more tart, more intensely flavored, and they have never appeared in a grocery store because they cannot be commercially cultivated. They grow wild on mountain slopes and ridge lines and along the edges of clearings, and the only way to get them is to go and pick them yourself. A cobbler made from huckleberries, baked under a biscuit crust with butter and sugar, is something that cannot be replicated in a restaurant kitchen, because the ingredient does not exist in a supply chain. It lives only in places where people still go into the woods. 6 sweet potato pie. Black American South, throughout the 1940s. Not pumpkin. This needs to be said clearly and without qualification. Sweet potato pie and pumpkin pie are not the same dish. Sweet potato pie is denser, more complex, slightly more savory, with a depth that pumpkin has never achieved. It is one of the foundational dishes of Black American culinary tradition, developed in the kitchens of the South over generations, and it was systematically overlooked by the mainstream food industry for most of the 20th century. Pumpkin pie was marketed nationally. Sweet potato pie was made at home. The one made at home was better, 5 fried apple pies. Appalachia and rural South 1940s. Dried apples, peeled, sliced, hung in the fall, stored through winter, rehydrated in a pot with sugar and cinnamon until they softened into a thick, concentrated filling. Spooned onto circles of lard pastry, folded over, crimped shut, fried in a skillet of hot fat until the crust blistered and browned. The filling inside was jammy and intensely apple-flavored in a way that no fresh apple has ever quite matched. Today, every farmer's market in America sells a version of this for $6 and calls it a hand pie. The women of eastern Tennessee made them for nothing and made them better for Indian pudding. New England, throughout the 1940s, cornmeal and molasses and ginger and cinnamon and milk, stirred together and poured into a baking dish and placed in a low oven for 3 hours. It emerged dark and dense and trembling at the center and smelling of ginger and burnt sugar. It was eaten warm with a spoon. It cooled into something denser. It was one of the oldest desserts in New England, a colonial adaptation of indigenous corn preparation, and by 1970 it had nearly vanished entirely from American kitchens. It has almost no defenders left. That is a loss that does not announce itself. It just quietly disappears. 3 blackberry dumplings. Rural South and Appalachia, 1940s. Wild blackberries, foraged from the hedgerows and the creek banks, free, available to anyone willing to walk far enough and accept the scratches, simmered in a pot with water and sugar until the berries burst and the liquid turned deep purple and syrupy. Dumplings of flour and lard and buttermilk, dropped in by the spoonful, covered, cooked until they were soft and had absorbed the color and the flavor of the berries beneath them. The dessert that required only a pot, a fire, and a willingness to go into the woods. The woods are still there. The willingness is what we lost. 2 jam cake. Appalachia and the Deep South, 1940s. Whatever jam remained at the end of the season, blackberry, strawberry, muscadine, whatever had been put up in July, folded directly into a spiced cake batter and baked. The jam sweetened the cake and kept it moist, and gave it a color and flavor that changed with every batch, with every season, with every family's particular combination of whatever fruit grew near their particular piece of ground. No 2 jam cakes ever tasted exactly alike. That was not a flaw in the recipe. That was the recipe. The variation was the point. The jar of jam remembered the summer. The cake carried it forward into winter. 1 cracklin' cookies. Deep South, 1940s. Pork cracklings, the crisp, rendered scraps left after lard was made, ground fine, and folded into a sweetened dough with flour and molasses and spice, and baked until the edges crisped and the centers stayed slightly chewy. Sweet and savory, before that was a culinary concept. Before any Brooklyn bakery put fleur de sel on a chocolate chip cookie and called it innovative. Before the food industry discovered that salt and sugar together sell. These grandmothers discovered it in a farmhouse kitchen in Louisiana in 1941, with cracklings they couldn't afford to throw away, and molasses they'd been stretching since October. Nobody has heard of this cookie. Everyone who ever tasted one never forgot it. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation funded directly by the sugar industry, paid 3 Harvard scientists to publish a review in a major medical journal that blamed dietary fat for heart disease and cleared sugar of any role. The scientists were paid the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money. The research shaped American dietary policy for the next 50 years. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The grandmothers sweetening with blackstrap molasses were delivering iron and calcium and potassium with every dessert. The industry replaced those sweeteners with refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup and then paid scientists to make sure nobody asked why. That is not nutrition science. That is a purchase dressed up as a study, closing stack cake carried to a neighbor's wedding, layer by layer, by hands that had been baking since before sunrise. Chicken and dumplings stretched across 2 meals for 7 people from one old bird that cost 15 cents. Oxtail simmered for 4 hours until it surrendered every gram of flavor it contained into a broth that set solid overnight. These women were not making do. That phrase does not belong anywhere near what they were doing. They were feeding families on almost nothing and producing meals that grown men still describe with their eyes closed 70 years later, in voices that sound like they are describing something sacred. Because they are, the food industry did not improve on what these kitchens made. It studied it, simplified it, stripped it of nutrition, repackaged it with a brand name and a price tag, and placed it on a shelf between 2 other products it also invented the need for. The molasses became corn syrup, the lard became Crisco, the oxtail became a $34 restaurant entree, the cracklin' cookie became a sweet and savory artisan confection. That is not progress. That is theft, conducted slowly, over decades, in a language that sounded like improvement. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.